Good evening, everyone. Wow, that was lovely. That was just great. Thank you for coming out tonight. This evening's event, a public dialogue on inclusion and sustainable development. I'm Hillary Hoynes. I'm an economist and in the School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley and the Haas Distinguished Chair in Economic Disparities. And I have the honor of welcoming you all tonight and introducing our evening speaker, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Before giving the appropriate introduction to our esteemed speaker, I want to take a few minutes to tell you about the Haas Institute and in particular the research clusters and the economic disparities cluster that I have the privilege to lead. So as many of you most likely know, the Haas Institute is part of the UC Berkeley Initiative for Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity, and is made possible in part from a generous gift from the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. And the Haas Institute is organized into 7 research clusters and draws upon Berkeley's incredible multidisciplinary research excellence and history of engaged scholarship. So I am the faculty lead of one of these 7 clusters, called the Economic Disparities Cluster. And this cluster consists of faculty from more than 8 departments around the campus, from economics and sociology to African American studies, city and regional planning, and geography. And the faculty in the Economic Disparities cluster address issues around economic inequality and the economic, political, and social consequences of socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, and other factors. So with this background and introduction to the Economic Disparities Cluster, I welcome you all here tonight, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is the university professor at Columbia University. He's an economist and professor of sustainable development, as well as health policy and management. He's currently the director for the Center for Sustainable Development and a special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General, both current and past Secretary Generals. And Professor Sachs recently concluded his time as director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Professor Sachs is one of the leading experts across the world in economic development and the fight against poverty worldwide. His work focuses on ending poverty, overcoming macroeconomic instability, promoting economic growth, fighting hunger and disease, and promoting sustainable environmental practices. Professor Sachs is a prolific author. Among the many books he has written in the past dozen or so years are The End of Poverty, Commonwealth Economics for a Crowded Planet, and The Age of Sustainable Development. Much of his writing is focused on global poverty and worldwide sustainable development. As someone who's spent their career studying poverty and inequality in the United States, it is with great personal interest that Professor Sachs has, in his most recent book, turned his attention to the United States. So Professor Sachs's current book is entitled Building the New American Economy, Smart, Fair, and Sustainable. And the book charts a better course for American public policy based on long-term societal objectives around the concept of sustainable development. It is worth pointing out that the UN Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are 17 in total, include, among the 17, the goals of no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, and reduced inequalities. With US child poverty rates at 19.7%, food insecurity at 12.7%, and inequality at historically high levels, these goals are as important in the US today as in potentially anywhere around the world. So the roadmap for this evening is that Professor Sachs is going to give some remarks, and that is going to be followed by a lovely conversation in the chairs to my left, and then after that there will be a book signing out in the hallway. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
So nice. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me and letting me join this very, very wonderful and very important conference, and very timely. Donald got his 100 days. Now he can go home. Now it's our turn. That's what I figure. Wow, what a mess. I think that the right thing to realize is almost anything he says, do the opposite. It is probably the one measure of consistency. And maybe a core of my remarks is to just put us on notice about what's coming with this tax fight, because this is the most disgusting and outrageous part of the whole agenda. Trump and his cronies dream of nothing more than cutting taxes for the rich and leaving a massive, massive debt on young people without the slightest care of how to pay for it, except by what they can get away with taking people off of health insurance and any other cuts in government spending. And so we have a real mobilization issue that is going to be a very important one and a very tough one. And I think that this conference is really not only crucial in all its topics, but is a good warm-up for the big fights ahead. Fortunately, the guy is so incompetent he can't put forward a coherent idea. And that is our saving grace so far. So we will see whether that remains the case, but they're going to be fighting very hard for othering and for the opposite of belonging in the days ahead. You know very well that U.S. society is more unequal than at any time in its modern history. Say, if we take the data back to the beginning of the 20th century. And that is a stark and grim fact. And I think the most important aspect is that there's absolutely nothing necessary about that. This is not a law of economics. This is not some inevitability even of modern globalization or modern capitalism. We are an outlier from the point of view of rich countries. We are the most unequal, the most unfair. We have the worst outcomes now on many public health dimensions. All of you, I'm sure, are aware of the stunning facts of rising mortality rates among white non-Hispanics 50 to 65 years old that have been studied carefully by the Nobel laureate Angus Deaton and Ann Case. These are shocking findings, and they've been building up for decades. And a lot of that has to do with the theme of othering, because that is definitely America's weak spot. Let me explain just for a moment. Market economies, if you let the economies run as they would through market forces and kind of somewhat normal politics, do not produce fair outcomes. And there is nothing in economic theory and nothing in economic experience that says that they do. Market economies can produce a lot of wealth. They can generate a lot of innovation. In fact, the American economy is an extraordinarily dynamic economy. It is an extraordinarily innovating economy for 200 years of history. It continues to this day to make stunning innovations, and of course, you know, we're in the part of the country that's been the epicenter of that for the last 40 years and continues to be the most dynamic driver of innovation. But there's nothing that makes the outcomes of that fair. This neighborhood, Palo Alto and Silicon Valley, is churning out billionaires at a really very impressive rate. And it is in the midst of a lot of poverty and absolute desperation in our country as well. And that's normal that those can go together from a purely economic point of view. The question is really the question of this conference: what does a society make of those outcomes? And the fact is that different places among the rich world make very, very different choices about how to regard the dynamism and the innovation of a market economy. My favorite places in the world from the point of view of most successful, rounded societies that get more things right than any other places overall are the Scandinavian countries. So if you look at Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they're very rich. They're comparable to US income by and large. Even Norway shows up a bit higher. But however the data are defined, basically similar averages, but with a tremendous degree of fairness that we choose not to have. Those countries have the same forces of globalization. They have the same trade with China. They have the same technological changes of automation and robots and other things which are forces that in the market economy are producing widening income inequality. But they choose to address that in a completely different way from the United States. Because the starting point in a social democracy is everybody should benefit from society's progress. The economy is there to meet the needs of all of the citizens. And in particular, any poor child in the society should have essentially the same life chances as anybody else in the society. And so if you look at the outcomes in those countries, compare them to the United States, they have longer life expectancy. They have inequality drastically lower than in the US. The technical measurement that is probably best for this is called the Gini Coefficient, a value that goes between 0, total equality, and 1, high income inequality, total income inequality. And the US is a quite high inequality of about 0.45, which is the highest among the rich countries. And the Scandinavian countries are the lowest income inequality at about 0.25 to 0.3. Poverty rates of children, Hillary mentioned it just now, are essentially non-existent. Healthcare is universal access. Tuition at all levels of education are free. Vacation time is guaranteed for all workers. Maternity and paternity leave are guaranteed for all families. This is just the way things are done. And I had a taste of it. Recently, I was in an airport in Oslo, and I had a business class ticket, and I was running to get the flight, and I ran up to the front of the line, and I said, "Where is business class boarding?" And the fellow looked at me with a tremendous disdain. You could see the bubble. He must be an American. And he looked at me and he said, "Excuse me, we're boarding the Scandinavian way. Get in the back of the line." So it's just a different view of society. And I think that this is really the most important thing for us to understand. These are choices that we make. Now, Trump has, let me actually step back one moment. Sad fact, this widening of income inequality started, we can date it to the hour, by the way. It was 10 a.m. January 20, 1981, when this state sent Mr. Reagan to Washington. No thank you. Because Reagan said in his opening remarks, in his inaugural address, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. And he started this country off on an incredible divergence from normalcy. Because his mission was slash the taxes. And he did it, and since then, and since Walter Mondale lost the 1984 election by making a statement which was true, absolutely true, as you would expect from Mondale, he said, he's going to raise your taxes, we're going to have to raise taxes because of the deficit. I'm telling you I'll do it. He won't tell you, but he'll do it too. And Mondale, of course, lost 49 states. And the lesson that both the Democrats and Republicans took from that was that everybody should promise tax cuts, basically, or only symbolic tax increases at the top. And the irony of ironies is that Barack Obama signed into law, with his approval, making permanent almost all of the tax cuts of George W. Bush, because that's how our politics worked for the last 36 years. And that's what we're about to face again. Why do I emphasize that? Because what is it that enables a Sweden or Norway or Denmark, and for that matter, Canada is a lot like that as well, much closer to home. What is it that makes that possible? Very simple. They collect tax revenues that are then used to pay for health, for education, for childcare, for vacation, for other basic needs. Because that's how you have a decent society in a market economy. You let the market economy run. It can be very dynamic indeed, but the outcomes can be shared by everybody. So now we're facing again, for the I don't know how many times, the disgrace of the government telling us that the most important thing for us is tax cuts. They're going to be big, they're going to be beautiful, says this man. But it gets more and more absurd. And please understand this, because after 36 years of this now, we are collecting the lowest level of national income in government revenues and have squeezed to the point of elimination most of the federal programs at this point. What's just hanging in there is a bit of health care, Social Security, and of course the bombs that we protect. But what has gone away is what's called the discretionary part of the civilian budget, because there's no money for it left anymore. And that's what they're trying to kill. And in the Republican fantasy world, they want to kill even the core of health care and the core of Social Security as well. Because if you don't collect taxes, you cannot have a decent society. So to give you the numbers, we are collecting at local, state, and federal level about 32% of national income in taxes. At the federal level, it's 18%. If you look at Norway or Sweden or Denmark, they're collecting 50%. And that difference, roughly 15 to 20% of GDP, is what makes possible decency. It is what makes possible social mobility. It's what makes possible modern infrastructure that doesn't collapse. It's what makes possible a green economy, rather than the phony, polluting, extraordinarily dangerous economy that we're still living in this country, and doing profound damage to the rest of the world also, because there's no money to make the conversion in the government budgets. So that is really the difference. And the evidence is overwhelming that you get what you pay for in economics. It may be the only law of economics. And we're getting what we're paying for. The rich have walked away from responsibility. The mega gazillionaires are, I don't know what you do after your first $10 billion. What is the point? I'm sure that for each of us, even $2 billion is enough. So what are they thinking? And why are they fighting so hard to wreck our country and do so much damage to vulnerable people? And why the obsession of cutting the taxes? Why the obsession of cutting the taxes when the report comes out on the health bill that they're going to try again to do that says 26 million people will lose their health care coverage, and all you get is a shrug of the shoulders from Speaker Ryan? That's pathetic. That isn't even... Let me make one final point. Ayn Rand is not a philosopher. All right? She was a miserable woman. Honestly, there is a theory of philosophy that you look at the quality of the philosophers' lives. She was a miserable lady. Her sister came from Russia after decades of separation. She was so miserable, all she did was lecture her about objectivism for 2 weeks and send this poor woman home never to see her again. Disgusting. This is not philosophy. This is greed, this is short-sightedness, this is othering, this is what's ruining America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey Sachs. So in a moment, Jeffrey will be joined by Kumi Naidoo and John Powell. So, you know, part of what I'm doing is I have this great pleasure of reading people's bios. And when I read Kumi Naidoo's bio, and he was born in Durban, South Africa, I found out that he's been a human rights activist since he was 15. And he became involved then in anti-apartheid activities and violence against women. But this is the part that I liked. The work is fantastic, but he got kicked out of high school for doing the right thing. And he's still doing the right thing. He's been involved in neighborhood organizing and youth work in his community and mass mobilizations against the apartheid regime at that time. And of course, he was arrested many more times. But he currently serves as the launch executive director to the African Civil Society Initiative, which is an ambitious and evolving new initiative that seeks to unite civil society across the continent. And so what he's really dealing with are issues of corruption, inequality, shrinking democratic space, climate change, poverty, and of course, gender equality. Thank you, Kumi Naidoo, for your work. John Powell probably doesn't need much introduction. And for those of you who don't know, Professor Powell is the African American Studies and Ethnic Studies chair at UC Berkeley. Did I get that right, John? Yes. And he writes and speaks extensively on race, structural racialization, poverty, fair housing, voting rights, identity, spirituality, social justice, and the needs of citizens in a democratic society. So as you can see, we have a stellar, passionate panel of conversation that's going to happen, but I do have to say one more thing about you, John. So have you noticed that John emits this sort of glow? Have you noticed that? And I want you to know, John would say that that comes from his good genes, which is probably true, but also from his deep meditation practice. So it was great pleasure. I invite you two powerful, amazing beings to come to the stage. Please help me welcome them.
So I'm going to start off, and I read Professor Sachs' latest book, and as I was going through it, I read a lot of his stuff, and I think I noticed a change. But in this book, if you have chance, I think it's out in the hallway, you should read it. It's something that could come out of this conference, almost on every issue. He doesn't use the terms othering and belonging, but he actually gives that as a prescription for the United States, and one might say the world. And when you read it, it's so logical. It makes so much sense. And yet it's not being done. It's not being done here, and even in Europe, where we have had a history of robust social welfare, which also means reducing inequality, and then we have the Paris Climate Agreement, it's being challenged. We have an election coming up in Paris or in France, and Le Pen is a serious candidate. And so what I want to really posit is, if it's so logical and so urgent, why can't we get there? Why is it, I mean, you can understand someone lining their pockets, maybe, with another billion. But why are poor Americans voting for someone to line their pocket with billions? And I think part of the answer, from my own perspective, has to do with race and identity and others. But I want you to grapple with that a little bit, Professor Sachs. And let me just mention also, for those of you who don't know, Kumi was also the executive director of Greenpeace International, which is, if you don't know, it's the largest environmental organization in the world.
You know, I think there are a few strands of this American weirdness and the direction that we've taken. Part of it is just straight politics, that money deeply infected our political system over the last 40 years in ways that are even unusual by our own standards. And what's interesting is how cheap Congress is to buy. The Koch brothers really did it. And it's not even a cliche. I mean, they literally have taken over the Republican Party by a few $billion. Not much if between the two of them they have $100 billion of net worth. And so the lobbying and the big money in our politics, and Citizens United was certainly one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in modern history. A disgrace. And really, when you read it, also shockingly disgraceful, because the opinion says that letting loose corporate money won't undermine confidence in government. So totally phony claim by the Supreme Court majority in that. So money is one thing. Of course, racism has been a core challenge for everything about social democracy in America for our whole history. And we know from both common sense and American history and lots of careful empirical studies that race has been played as the great divide of working class and poor people, of course, throughout our politics. And when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, he famously said, well, there goes the South for a generation in the Democratic Party. And he just had the dates wrong, because it was 50 years since then. And that was absolutely a response by race. And many political scientists have shown that states in the U.S. with higher minority population, African American and Hispanic, raise less revenues and distribute less revenues, because the other is always lurking there, and the mentality is, well, I'm going to be poor, but I'm not going to give it to them. And so that has been absolutely a part of this. But it's also important to remember that we've had our moments in America where we did better, much better. And really, we had a great run in a certain way. I mean, it was disasters and many, but a great run politically from FDR through Johnson on the domestic side, where there was really a tremendous amount of progress in making America a much more fair society. And we happened to watch a skit, my wife who's here, and I watched a skit of Mort Sahl, the comedian, from 1968, explaining politics. And it was shocking because he said social democracy, and he put that in the middle of the political spectrum. Now we don't have anything. Social democracy so far to the left of our two mainstream parties, except for Bernie, that it's amazing that in '68 you could talk in a completely different direction. So America definitely went right. It wasn't completely ingrained. We shifted, and the Reagan era till now was that shift. And then there's one more factor, which is the one you raised, and an extremely crucial one, and it's the othering of migration and refugees. And it's just amazing to watch. Even in the Scandinavian countries, you have the right-wing populist Trump-style parties. And Trump's argument, when you ask, why do people in working class people in Detroit, my hometown, or in the Midwest vote for him? One thing to remember is, of course, in such a grotesque, obvious, and false way, he played the other card on everything. And everything that he said, it came down to one basic point, which is, why are you suffering? Well, that's easy. Mexican rapists, Muslim terrorists, and Chinese currency manipulators. That works. Not as an explanation of anything. Nothing could be more bizarre from an economic analysis point of view. There isn't anything in any of that that has any hope of doing any good, period. It's all bullshit. Everything. But it can work once for a demagogue. And it's dangerous, of course, extremely dangerous. And I think that this is, if I could just, I'm sorry to talk too long, but one last thought. I gave some lectures in February about ethics and economics, basically complaining about how our field lost any contact with moral theory and moral reasoning over basically more than 100-year period. And so in studying this, in preparing, I was really quite taken by my guru, E.O. Wilson, the biologist, his observations about the lessons of evolutionary psychology, what we've learned. And the basic claim, and I just wanted to put it on the table because I think it's worth really pondering and discussing, is that human nature has both the belonging and the othering side to it inherently. And, I think religions have understood this, and theologians have understood this, and the evolutionary psychologists argue now that in our evolutionary makeup, meaning our deep human history, the belonging is the belonging to our group, and the othering is the fight of our group against the other groups. And the claim is that in that long period of Homo sapien evolution on the African savanna, where we all derive our human nature, that we had a dual process of being able to develop wonderful altruism, but almost always primed by group membership, And we have this unbelievable capacity for evil, for violence, for nastiness, for susceptibility to demagoguery that's also deeply part of our human nature, because the group solidarity was in the service of war with other groups. And so we are very vulnerable, obviously. That is the theme of the meeting. We're very vulnerable to othering. But my sense is that it's deep within us, and therefore it has to be brought absolutely relentlessly to our attention, to our awareness, through education, through practice, through mentoring, through great leaders that are our moral leaders, because it's not going to be instincts that are going to get us there. And I think that that's what Trump played on once. It's so bad as economics, it's so disgraceful and disgusting, and as humanity, because you can't even watch the guy without watching that evil sneer of his. But he's playing on something, unfortunately, that is real and deep.
Thank you. So I'm going to let Kumi pose the question, but the people who are the technical people, we have feedback on the mics, so I don't know if you can fix that. But anyway, Kumi?
Good evening. Thank you, John. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I just first correct the title that I was introduced by, but it's a reflection of the moment that we live in, because a few months ago, the initiative was called African Civil Society Initiative, but in this very dynamic moment of change, the movement that I represent here is Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity. Wow, I didn't expect applause for that, but thank you very much. Let me start on what might sound a flippant note, but I say this quite sincerely. Don't have very high expectations from three of us for this session. One, we are all men, and second, we are all above 52.
Thank you.
Right? I say that only half tongue-in-cheek, because I think that we are suffering from a very deep sense of cognitive dissonance. That the first thing that I think American society must come to terms with is that they have been deluding themselves for far too long that they are actually a meaningful democracy. The US at best today can be described as a liberal oligarchy. It has become it's driven by a parasitic and predatory elite that, if we listen to Eisenhower some years ago when he warned us against the military-industrial complex and the threat that that actually constituted, then we would realize that actually the undermining of the US democratic values actually started, I would argue, even before Ronald Reagan. And what we see today is an unwillingness, not only on the part of our political leaders, but even of us in civil society, to come to terms with the harsh facts that we face. Let me put one fact in the middle of the conversation. We know now, through multiple research, that if the consumption patterns that we have in developed, so-called developed countries and amongst the elites in developing countries were to be globalized, we would need between 5 and 8 planets to deliver that to people. We have, as the placard said in Washington, D.C. yesterday, we do not have a plan B because we don't have a planet B. The reality is that most of our conversations has largely been rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while we are sinking. What is needed is what Martin Luther King said in 1965 when he said, "I refuse to adjust to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are trapped in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society." To believe that the current economic system that exists in the United States and globally is going to deliver the kind of social outcomes that we need is deluding ourselves, deluding the future, and the one thing that we cannot do any longer is delude young people, either in the United States or elsewhere in the world, because that game is up. So when we're thinking about how divisions and othering happens, I think we have to recognize, as Jeff has correctly identified, that we are in, the only way I can say it eloquently, we are in deep, deep shit, right? And I say that very deliberately, that in fact, if you look at the climate question, we are not 5 minutes before midnight, we are 3 minutes before midnight, right? In the last 10 years, we've had more than 100% increase in extreme weather events. The Paris Agreement, right? Just so you are clear, all the Paris Agreement did was give us a chance to fight for another, to live to fight for another day. The Paris Agreement is inadequate. It has many problems. There are so many loopholes there. You can fly Air Force One through it, and so on. Okay? So within that context, I think we now have to be recognizing that some of the fundamental broad narratives, structures, systems, procedures that we called democracy is a real problem. And if I can make one last point, John, you know, when I encounter anti-American sentiment in Europe, especially during the Iraq War, I used to do a little bit of an experiment. I used to ask everybody in the audience, how many of you have seen CNN International? And almost everybody would put up their hands. Then I'll ask, how many of you think CNN International is a left-wing radical or particularly progressive news source? Everybody's hands goes down, right? And then I say to them, do you know that the citizens in the United States do not see CNN International? They see a more conservative brand of it called CNN or CNN Headline News, but actually in the political continuum within the United States, CNN is on the left of the political spectrum. So I give that to actually say that I have a lot of sympathy for the majority of American people that get manipulated. You know, as Nelson Mandela told us, that the struggle against that we were engaged in was not against white people, but it was a system of white economic exploitation, and that we needed to recognize that white people themselves were actually oppressed by a barrage of misinformation systematically built up over time. So my solution, what I would have to say that if we are going to actually recover things here, we need to look at how do people receive their information? How is public consciousness molded? And quite far too often we focus more on our governments use the repressive state apparatus to control us, you know, army, police, formal laws, and so on. And often in our analysis, we undermine how the ideological state apparatus is used, the framework for religion, the framework for schooling, and particularly the framework for media. So if we want to change things, one, we have to understand how consciousness and public awareness is created. Secondly, we have to recognize that the democratic systems that we have right now as the form of democracy without the substance of democracy, and it's a charade, and we need to look at how we reform and go back to basic principles. And thirdly, we must be brutally honest with ourselves. The current economic system that we are often afraid to challenge is broken, it's unjust, and must be radically transformed.
So let me throw a quick response and then throw something back to Professor Sachs. One thing I think I want to be, and this, you're going to have a chance to actually engage over this in the next couple of days, but I think from our perspective, it's very important for us to not only understand the problem, but also move toward solutions. And I think there's probably a high degree of consensus on what the problem is, although I think there's some complexity. I think in that complexities, there's some possibilities. And I don't think it's quite as evenly negative as we might think. So that's one statement. The other, though, is that we're here in California. California has the 6th largest economy in the world if it was independent, larger than Canada. I think Canada is number 11, although it's part of a federal system. So one question is, what can California do in terms of moving toward some solution? And one of the things we heard is that California is actually considering a single-payer universal healthcare system that would include undocumented immigrants. California is also considering universal free education. So the question is, so it's turning a little bit to solutions. Without saying these are complete solutions, are there things that we can put in place to build on? And I would even say that about the Paris Climate Accord. I'm not an expert in the way you are, Kumi, but I think we have to be a little bit careful if that half a loaf is worse than none at all. I think we can build on things. So anyway, any thoughts about what California, maybe New York, a couple other relatively blue states, relatively diverse states, can do to actually, even in this environment, begin to actually put things in place to move us to a different place?
There's actually a lot of room for maneuver, and California's using a lot of it. You know, if you look at what California has, which you know well, you have the cutting edge of all of the technologies that we need to solve the climate problem. Within this state, solar power alone and Elon Musk combined produce basically a massive decarbonization potential. And California is on a trajectory that it chose before the rest of the country to decarbonize the California economy by 80% by 2050. And even more than that is possible because we know more or less what a technological pathway looks like to do that. And what it looks like is moving to electric vehicles or some equivalent, because there are equivalents, but something like an electric vehicle-based economy and low carbon energy generation. And the Mojave by itself is a big part of the solution. And very smart grid and an IT-based system that can lead to tremendous energy efficiencies, because with the smart system that is bringing different parts of the load on and off, when the off part, when it's not needed, the trajectory to basically get the CO2 emissions down to near zero is all within California's hands. And to California's great credit, it said, we're moving in this direction. Whether the rest of the country is or not, and California has been on that path now for almost 20 years. And it's creating businesses that will go worldwide as competitive in exactly those industries. The hard part about localizing all successes is one thing, just to understand it, and that is the tax conundrum. Because if one state taxes very heavily compared to other states, then you get movement of business across states, and that's why doing things at a federal level from the revenue side is advantageous compared to calling on each state to do it on its own. But it's still not impossible. It is possible because California is so big, so dynamic, so competitive, so much cutting-edge industry, so much renewable energy potential. California can basically say, we're going to stay sane if the rest of the world goes crazy. I want New York to come along with you. We got some good things too, but the problem for states to do it by themselves is only this issue of interstate tax competition, which is why we need a federal tax system, which we're always gutting these days. But putting that aside, states have much more ability to move, especially the major states, I mean, large populations and a major technology and industrial base. So I think it's a very well taken point.
So I think we're out of time. I just want to posit just one quick question, and I'd also give Kumi a chance to make any last comments. California and New York, both blue states, are also two of the most unequal states in the union. So it's like, even though there's all this progressive possibility, there's also rampant inequality in our schools, in our income. So I don't know if you have a quick thought about that. And Kumi, I want to also give you a chance to make a comment.
Thanks, John, for raising the inequality issue, because one of the SDGs is, in fact, reducing inequality. And I would argue that the problem with the SDG package is there are a lot of inconsistencies. If you push on the growth target...
Tell people what SDG is.
Oh, sorry, the Sustainable Development Goals that Jeff referred to in his comments. So, like, if you push the growth goal, then in fact you bust your carbon budget and so on. But I would posit that the issue of addressing inequality, if we do not do that within the Sustainable Development Goal package globally and in different national contexts, if we don't address inequality, forget the rest of the goals. They're just not going to happen. Second quick comment about what I think about progressive interventions by a relatively progressive state like California, the examples you gave on education and healthcare, I think I would encourage it, right? Notwithstanding what Jeff said about it's hard when you're trying to do it in one subnational context. But I think that, if you look at the history, where there's political will in certain spaces, people must go for it and push it as far as we can. And I think that as an outsider looking at the United States, it seems like there are several countries in the United States, but the East Coast and the West Coast, which are outward-facing parts of the United States, tend to be relatively more open and progressive and so on. So I think if California seriously went down this road, we should not rule out the fact that other Western states, and you're seeing some of the most progressive things happening on marijuana reform, on gay marriage and so on, happening in some of these states. So I think it should not be seen as isolated for itself, the roll-on effect. And basically people are hungry for examples of progressive things that work, and to create it in any space, I think that gives us a vision of what can be possible. The Paris thing, I just want to clarify, I'm glad you raised that. Let me just be very clear. The Paris Climate Agreement is the best thing we have on the table right now. I make the point about it being so far from perfect to make the point, even this imperfect compromise deal where the US had far too much influence in its outcome is something that this crazy person you've put in the White House is determined to kill, right? So understand that if this deal, weak as it might be, but the best we could get that the politics would allow us to offer gets destroyed, then we are seriously in a hopeless situation. So I would like to appeal to people, to understand, and maybe to just end on if I can end on a positive note. People,
why not?
People like me, sorry, you're going to regret having laughed at that. People like me love to say things like save the planet, save the environment, save the climate. So let me just leave you with this happy thought. The planet does not need saving. The planet is absolutely fine, because the logical consequence of us continuing on the overconsumptive path that we are on, that is dependent on oil, coal, gas, and other polluting economic activity, what will be the end result? We'll warm the planet up to the point where our water runs dry, our soil gets destroyed, we don't have food, the planet is too hot, and ultimately, we will be gone, the planet will still be here. And truth be said, once we become extinct as a species, the oceans will recover, the forests will replenish, and so on. So don't worry about saving the planet. Don't worry about saving the planet. Understand the struggle that we are engaged in is whether humanity can fashion a way to coexist with nature in a mutually interdependent relationship for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, the struggles that we are now must be engaged in is a struggle to ensure that we secure our children and their children and their children's future. And however difficult the systemic and structural changes that we need to make, we must have the courage and the political will to make it, because there's nothing more important than safeguarding the future of our children and their children and future generations. Thank you.
So unless I hear otherwise, oh, there was going to be cards, but I don't know if they were handed out.
You know what, I hate to say this. We have time for 2 questions. 2 questions.
But can there really
that's
be questions?
I'm sorry?
Can there really be questions?
Can there be questions?
Yes, 2 of them. 2 people can ask a question. And so if you have a question, I think there's a mic person over here and maybe one over here. And, but let me say this while you're preparing what you're going to ask, is that Kumi will be back tomorrow, and we will have more opportunity to engage with him, and Jeff will be doing a book signing after this panel is over, so that's the happy note. You'll have more time to talk to them. So, question, please stand up and say your name.
Hi, over here, right in front of you.
Okay.
My name is Eric Kornacki. I flew in from Denver, and it's a pleasure to be here. Professor Sachs, I studied you quite a deal in college, and never thought I'd have the opportunity to ask you a question, so here we go. You spoke a lot about the Scandinavian countries as a positive example of social democracy, and you mentioned the choices that they make to pay higher taxes, to provide social safety nets, to have a progressive agenda for their people. And the question I have for you, you kind of touched a little bit on it in your in the public discourse here, but here in the US, we're not a homogeneous country. Scandinavian countries, I think, are about 90–95% homogeneous. And so my question to you is, do you see the Scandinavian models holding up in a country with such great diversity? And I would love to hear your thoughts on how we need to make the choice to address race and structural oppression and the history of slavery and racism that capitalism in America was based on, before we talk about Scandinavian countries as a positive example that we need to strive to.
I think what you learn from looking at the other countries is what our options are. Understanding that they are not the options that we're taking raises all of the questions of our history and our divisions and so on, but not, it doesn't really undermine, in my opinion and experience, it doesn't undermine the lessons that can be gleaned about how we can make our systems work better. The idea that America is unique because of its size or its diversity or its history, therefore it can't learn from these other experiences, to my mind is not correct. We absolutely can and should learn that the reasons why our health care is twice as expensive as anyone else's is because of how we have chosen to organize it, or the reasons why the social mobility in this country is so much less has a lot to do with how we have organized the education and other social systems in this country. These are choices, is the point that I'm making, and that these experiences, these other experiences, are real and valid. Canada, I think, provides, as I said, a lot of lessons for the United States as well. It's a big, very diverse country. It doesn't have the same history exactly, of course, but it is a country managing its diversity a lot better than the US. And diverse or not, a single-payer health system is going to be a lot better for us than the mess that we have. We have the mess, not, by the way, because of our diversity, but because of the lobbying of the healthcare industry. Of course, it's also exacerbated by the willingness of our society to, or it's parts of our society, especially the powerful parts, to tolerate a great deal more inequality. But let me say one more point, if I may. What you also learn from other countries that are functioning a lot better is that there's nothing automatic in their successes. The ones that I'm pointing out work very hard to achieve their successes. They analyze problems, they have white papers of government policy, they debate these issues with the extreme concern and seriousness, and we don't. Our politics are not only broken in the social relations, they're broken in the institutional mechanisms. If you look at this recent Obamacare repeal, it's shocking from simply a process point of view. What do I mean by that? Well, we know that the Republican plan was kept in a safe so that, God forbid, another American should see it, until one day it was released. The next day it was voted out of committee without a single word of testimony by anybody. And then 3 committees passed it in a completely rigged way, and then it was so god-awful that it stalled. But the mindlessness of that process should be appreciated, which was, this was not deliberative, this was not analytical, this was not transparent, this was not discussed. This is a full-fledged breakdown of the most basic aspects of rational policy making. So the issues that we're talking about are complicated issues. They are not simple issues. Making an energy transformation, managing a healthcare system that's nearly $4 trillion right now in annual costs. These are not simple. They have solutions, but they require analysis, science, which is why the march last week. They require process that's completely different. Legislation should not be written by lobbies. Legislation should not be written in back rooms. And so the process part is something that we also should learn from the better performing and better governing countries right now, because we've lost even the most basic aspects here of rational deliberation. And I think that that's a part of why we're seeing such bad choices. And I will say also that we used to do better. This is not something intrinsic in American failure that our society, because of its bad history in many areas, can't think or can't deliberate or can't plan. That's not true. We have done better in the past, and we're going to have to do better in the future.
Thank you.
So before we go to the next question, let me just add a couple of things to what Professor Sachs just said. So we're here in California. California has a lot of problems. It hasn't solved the issue of racism. It hasn't solved the issue of how it treated indigenous people or Latinos. But having said that, California, one of the most diverse states in the United States, is also one of the most socially cohesive, which is a little bit counterintuitive. Because if diversity was just a direct drive toward division, California should be extremely divided. Now, those of you who have been here for a while remember that when Pete Wilson was governor, he actually ran a whole campaign against Latinos. And at that point, California was a Republican state, and it ran on division. And a few years later, all the Republicans are gone. And California is more diverse. So even with our troubled histories, there are some things we can learn. And I think that also is a lesson, or potentially a response to Wilson's concerns. So we are wired for belonging and othering, but we have to be careful with that, because there's no natural other. There is no natural other. And
We create them.
We create the other is a social, and so we can play with that a whole bunch of ways. So Wilson, I read him, I love his work, but he sort of takes us down, I think, a pessimistic path, which I think our experience tells us we shouldn't be too reliant on.
Thank you, John. May we have one question for Kumi, please? One question.
Hi. First, I have to say how inspiring all of this has been. Thank you so much. But the question, when you were talking about the wonderfulness of what's been done in New York or could continue to be done in New York and in California, I'm from Massachusetts, which also has some wonderful things. But what scares me is what happens to the rest of the country if these 3 states work on developing their wonderful ideas.
Can I take that? So I'll take that even though I'm not from the United States or any of those 3 states in question, though I've visited all of them. So I think we're at a point now where what is needed is not simply out-of-the-box thinking, but we actually have to take the box and throw it away altogether and press the reset button in some of our fundamental constructs about economy, about society, about health systems, education systems, and so on. So I would not be discouraged about the fact that there are at least some bright spots. If I can use a very bad reference to George Bush when he said 1,000 points of light, right? So the fact that we got a couple of lights, real lights, not like, I think let's bank that, let's harvest that, let's encourage that, and let's try and create as many spaces for new ideas, new thinking, new innovations to emerge. And I think that it's a tragedy that many parts of a big country like this might not be on board, but don't underestimate the power of imitation, the power of people wanting to replicate things that work. I'd like to just, this is the last chance, I'll just make a couple of concluding comments. I think I wanted to agree with Jeff when he said, do not underestimate how difficult and complex these systemic and structural changes might, are. And I maybe didn't use exactly the same words, but I want to say that just because, and that's 100% agreement, but there's an inspiration here from Mandela when Mandela once said, it always seems impossible until it has been done. And I think that the stakes here are very high. We're talking about human survival, not simply about whether we can, be okay-ish and so on, but we're talking here fundamentally about whether humanity as a species can succeed. And then I want to go back to quickly to conclude on this question of interrogating the quality of democracy that you have. Jeff mentioned Citizens United, which contaminates the political process more in terms of money. But I want to raise one issue that I don't find too many, even progressive Americans raising, and that is, often we get told in the United States we have a 2-party system. Actually, from an outside perspective, I think you have a 1.5-party system. What I mean by that is, nobody can tell me or anybody else that the rich diversity of American society can be captured by 2 parties, right, that largely have a very high level of overlap on very many policy areas and in the way they have functioned historically. For us in the developing world, let's say, there is very little distinction between what Democrats do and what Republicans do. So I would urge you to think about a more fundamental resurgence and investing of a broader, deep conversation of what does it take to give full expression to democratic will and democratic diversity that the American people constitute. And I'll leave you with one last thought from Albert Einstein, who said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get different results. And I think most American politicians and most business people in the United States and globally, including people like myself who've been on the activist side, if we're brutally honest, we all are pretty insane. We really need to start doing things in a fundamentally different way because it's not been working for the majority of people on the planet for a very, very long time. Not just with Trump, not just with Brexit, and not just with some of the recent catastrophes that we've had. Thank you.